Video 4. Hermeneutics 101. Eschatology. Matthew 24. Reading prophecy. In context. Big idea. Before interpreting Yeshua's answer, we must understand the question that prompted it. Introduction. If you have spent much time listening to Bible prophecy discussions, you have probably noticed that certain passages seem to dominate the conversation. Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Revelation 13, Revelation 20, and near the top of the list, Matthew 24. For many Christians, Matthew 24 feels like the center of the entire discussion. Questions about the tribulation, the coming of the Son of Man, the gathering of the elect, signs in the heavens, and the end of the age often lead people back to this chapter. Entire prophetic systems have been built upon its contents. Countless books have been written about it. Countless sermons have been preached from it. And countless debates have been fought over it. What is interesting, however, is how most people approach the chapter. They usually begin with the answers. They begin with verse 15, or verse 21, or verse 29, or verse 31. They immediately begin discussing the tribulation, the abomination of desolation, the coming of Messiah, or the gathering of the elect. In other words, they begin discussing Yeshua's answers before carefully examining the question that prompted those answers. Imagine walking into a room and hearing only half of a conversation. You hear someone say, "No, that isn't what happened at all. You completely misunderstood the situation." From those words alone, you might begin forming conclusions. You might assume you understand what is being discussed. You might even feel confident about your interpretation. But the reality is that you have not heard the question. You have not heard the earlier conversation. You have not heard the context. And because you do not know what prompted the response, there is a very good chance that you have misunderstood what the speaker intended to communicate. The same thing can happen when we study Scripture. One of the most important principles of interpretation is that answers are understood through questions. If we misunderstand the question, we may misunderstand the answer. If we ignore the conversation that created the question, we may end up forcing the answer to address issues the original speaker was never discussing. In our first lesson, we learned that assumptions influence interpretation. In our second lesson, we learned that biblical authors communicate in different ways, and that symbolic language often communicates literal truth. In our third lesson, we learned that biblical terms should be defined by examining all relevant evidence rather than relying upon assumptions. Today, we are going to build upon those lessons by learning another foundational principle of hermeneutics. Before interpreting an answer, understand the question. And few passages illustrate that principle more clearly than Matthew 24. Because before Yeshua ever gives an answer, the disciples ask a question. And before the disciples ask a question, something happens that creates the need for the question in the first place. That is where our investigation begins. Chapter 1. The conversation that created the question. When most people study Matthew 24, they begin in Matthew 24. That may sound obvious, but it is actually one of the biggest reasons the chapter is often misunderstood. We see the chapter number, we turn the page, and we assume a new discussion has begun. The problem is that Matthew did not write chapter numbers. Matthew did not divide his gospel into numbered sections. Those divisions were added many centuries later as a helpful way of locating passages. Most of the time, they are extremely useful. Occasionally, however, they can create the illusion that a new conversation has started when the author intended the reader to continue following the same train of thought. Matthew 24 is one of those places. To understand what happens in Matthew 24, we must first pay attention to what happens at the end of Matthew 23. The chapter closes with some of the strongest language Yeshua uses anywhere in the Gospel. After confronting the religious leadership and pronouncing a series of woes upon them, he turns his attention toward Jerusalem itself and says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her." Matthew 23:37. These are not the words of someone celebrating national revival. These are not the words of someone describing a glorious victory. They are the words of someone grieving over rejection, rebellion, and coming judgment. The chapter ends on a note of sorrow, warning, and lament. Then Yeshua makes a statement that should immediately capture our attention. He says, "See, your house is left to you desolate." Matthew 23:38. For the moment, we are not going to stop and debate every possible implication of that statement. That discussion belongs elsewhere. Right now, we are simply observing the flow of the conversation. Matthew wants us to notice the direction in which the discussion is moving. The final words of chapter 23 are filled with judgment language. The atmosphere is already changing. The conversation is already heading somewhere important. Then something happens that is easy to overlook. Yeshua leaves. Matthew immediately tells us, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple." Matthew 24:1. Notice how naturally the story flows. There is no indication that Matthew is changing subjects. There is no indication that an entirely new conversation has begun. The narrative simply continues. Words of judgment are spoken. The temple is left behind. The discussion moves forward. What we call Matthew 24 is actually the continuation of a conversation that was already underway before the chapter break ever appeared. This is where the disciples do something fascinating. Matthew tells us that they came to show him the buildings of the temple. Think carefully about that. Why would they do such a thing? Yeshua already knows the temple is there. He has taught there. He has walked through it. He has confronted religious leaders there. He does not need someone to point out the buildings. Yet the disciples specifically draw his attention to them. Matthew does not explicitly tell us why, but the context invites us to think carefully. They have just heard words of judgment. They have just heard language about desolation. They have just watched Yeshua leave the temple. And now their attention is fixed on the temple itself. Suddenly, the conversation begins to make much more sense. The temple discussion does not appear out of nowhere. The disciples are reacting to something. The context created the question. In fact, this may be one of the most important observations we make in this entire lesson. Before the disciples ask a question about the future, they first hear a prediction connected to judgment and the temple. Their question is not floating in isolation. It emerges from a conversation that has already begun. It grows out of statements that have already been made. It is connected to events that are already unfolding before their eyes. Imagine walking into the final 30 minutes of a movie. You might understand what the characters are saying. You might even understand the basic plot. But you would almost certainly miss important details because you were not present for the earlier scenes that gave meaning to the conversation. Context works the same way. The farther we separate a statement from its context, the greater the risk that we misunderstand what is happening. This is one reason why responsible interpretation requires patience. Sometimes the most important information appears before the verse we are studying. Sometimes it appears before the chapter we are studying. As we move forward, I want you to remember a simple principle. Matthew 24 did not begin with a question. It began with a conversation. And that conversation created the question. If we want to understand the answer Yeshua gives, we must first understand the discussion that prompted the disciples to ask in the first place. That is exactly what we are learning to do. Hermeneutics checkpoint. When I study a passage of Scripture, do I begin with the verse that interests me most, or do I take time to examine the conversation that led to it? Have I ever reached a conclusion about a verse without first understanding the context that produced it? Remember, context does not begin with the verse we are studying. Sometimes context begins before the chapter we are studying. And sometimes the key to understanding an answer is understanding the conversation that created the question. Chapter 2. The temple they could not imagine losing. Now that we understand the conversation that created the question, we need to understand something else. We need to understand why the disciples reacted the way they did. Modern readers often struggle at this point because we do not naturally feel the emotional weight of the temple. We read the word temple and perhaps imagine a church building, a cathedral, or some other religious structure. But that comparison is far too small. The temple was not simply a place where people gathered for worship. It stood at the very center of Jewish life. It was woven into the religious identity, national identity, and historical memory of the people. Think about the role the temple played in the life of Israel. Pilgrims traveled there for the appointed feasts. Priests served there. Sacrifices were offered there. National celebrations centered there. Generations had prayed toward Jerusalem. The temple represented far more than architecture. It represented the covenant story of the nation itself. When people thought about the worship of Elohim, they thought about the temple. When they thought about Jerusalem, they thought about the temple. When they thought about the history of their people, they thought about the temple. This helps explain why the disciples draw Yeshua's attention to the buildings. They are not pointing at an ordinary structure. They are pointing at something that represents stability, continuity, identity, and hope. To them, these buildings were not merely stone and mortar. They were part of the world as they knew it. The temple they were looking at was also an impressive sight. By the 1st century, the temple complex had been extensively expanded and renovated under Herod the Great. Whatever else may be said about Herod, he was an ambitious builder. The Temple Mount had been enlarged into a massive platform. Magnificent buildings rose above the city. Visitors approaching Jerusalem could see the complex dominating the landscape. Ancient writers describe the temple in language that conveys both its beauty and its scale. Portions of the structure were covered with brilliant white stone. Decorative elements reflected sunlight with such intensity that some observers compared it to looking at a snow-covered mountain. Massive stones formed parts of the supporting structure, some of which remain visible even today. The temple did not appear temporary. It appeared permanent. That detail matters, because Yeshua's response is not that the temple will suffer damage. His response is not that portions of it will require repair. His response is not that some future enemy will temporarily occupy it. Instead, he says, "Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Matthew 24:2. For modern readers, familiarity sometimes robs these words of their force. We know the temple was eventually destroyed. We know how the story unfolds. We know the prediction was fulfilled, but the disciples did not know any of that yet. Try to hear the statement as they would have heard it. They are standing before one of the most impressive structures in their world. They are looking at the center of Jewish worship. They are looking at the heart of Jerusalem. And Yeshua tells them that the entire thing will be torn down. Not partially damaged, not weakened, destroyed. This is one of those moments where we must enter the world of the original audience. Imagine someone telling you that every major institution that symbolizes your nation will soon disappear. Imagine hearing that the places you assume will always be there will suddenly be gone. Most people would immediately begin asking questions. What happened? How could this happen? What does it mean? What comes next? Human beings naturally connect events together. When something enormous is announced, our minds immediately begin constructing a larger picture. We start asking how this event relates to everything else we believe about the future. The disciples were no different. And that observation may be one of the most important in this entire lesson. The destruction of the temple would not have sounded like a small historical detail. It would have sounded like a world-changing event. It would have raised profound questions about Jerusalem, the kingdom, the future, and the purposes of Elohim. In other words, we are beginning to understand why the disciples ask the question they do. The conversation created the question, and the significance of the temple explains why the question carried such urgency. Now we are finally ready to examine the question itself. Chapter 3. What did the disciples actually ask? At this point in the story, Matthew slows the pace, and I think we should slow down with him. One of the easiest mistakes we can make when reading Matthew 24 is rushing ahead to Yeshua's answer before carefully examining the question that prompted it. We have already seen that the conversation began before the chapter break. We have seen that the disciples were reacting to statements concerning judgment and the temple. We have seen why the destruction of the temple would have sounded shocking and world-changing to first-century ears. Now we arrive at the moment that has generated centuries of discussion, debate, and disagreement. The disciples finally ask their question. There is an interesting detail that many readers overlook. The question is not asked immediately after Yeshua predicts the destruction of the temple. Matthew tells us that Yeshua leaves the temple area and eventually sits on the Mount of Olives. Only then do the disciples come to him privately. That means some time has passed. They have had an opportunity to think about what they have just heard. They have had an opportunity to discuss it among themselves. The prediction concerning the temple is still fresh in their minds, but the question does not come as an impulsive reaction. It comes after reflection. It comes after consideration, and it comes in a private setting away from the crowds. Matthew records their question this way. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Matthew 24:3. Now, if we approach this passage the way many prophecy discussions do, this would be the point where we immediately began answering those questions. We would start constructing timelines. We would begin discussing tribulation theories. We would compare competing prophetic systems, but that is not what we are going to do. At least not yet. One of the lessons we have been learning throughout this series is that observation must come before interpretation. Before we decide what the disciples meant, we should first pay careful attention to what they actually said. Notice how much is contained in a single verse. The disciples ask, "When will these things be?" Immediately, we should ask ourselves, what things? What events are they referring to? They also ask about the sign of Yeshua's coming. What did they mean by that expression? Then they ask about the end of the age. What exactly did that phrase mean to them? Even before we attempt to answer those questions, we can already see something important. The question itself contains ideas that deserve investigation. The disciples are not speaking carelessly. Their words are carrying meaning. And if we want to understand Yeshua's answer, we should first understand the language of the question. This is where many Bible students accidentally skip a crucial step. We often assume we already know what these expressions mean. We hear a phrase like, the end of the age, and immediately substitute our own definition. We hear a phrase like, your coming, and instantly import conclusions we have gathered from years of sermons, books, and conversations. But one of the recurring themes of this series has been that assumptions are not evidence. If we learned anything in video 1, it is that assumptions must be examined. If we learned anything in video 3, it is that biblical terms deserve investigation before they are used to build doctrine. The same principle applies here. Imagine a detective arriving at a crime scene. If he walks into the room already convinced that he knows exactly what happened, he may overlook important evidence. He may ignore details that do not fit his theory. He may stop observing because he has already reached a conclusion. A wise investigator does the opposite. He begins by asking questions. He notices details. He gathers evidence. He allows the facts to shape his conclusions rather than forcing the facts into conclusions he reached beforehand. Good Bible study works the same way. Before we explain a passage, we should first learn to observe it carefully. That is one reason I believe Matthew 24:3 is one of the most important verses in the entire discourse. Many readers treat it as little more than an introduction. They hurry through it on their way to what they consider the important prophetic material later in the chapter. But the question is not a speed bump on the way to prophecy. The question is the doorway into the entire conversation. Every word that follows is spoken in response to what the disciples ask here. If we misunderstand the question, we increase the likelihood that we will misunderstand the answer. If we ignore the question altogether, we may end up asking Matthew 24 to answer questions that the disciples themselves never raised. So before we move any further, let us simply acknowledge something. At this point in our study, we have not answered the disciples' question. In fact, we have barely begun examining it. But that is not a weakness. It is a strength. Good hermeneutics is willing to move slowly when a passage requires careful attention. We have already learned what created the question. We have learned why the temple prediction was so significant, and now we have identified the major components of the question itself. The next step is to look even more closely at the structure of the question, because interpreters have long debated whether the disciples are asking one question, multiple questions, or one larger question expressed through several related ideas. That is where our investigation leads next. Hermeneutics checkpoint. Before I begin interpreting a passage, have I carefully observed what the text actually says? Am I rushing toward answers because I am eager to defend a conclusion? Or am I slowing down long enough to identify the questions that require answers? Observation is not the enemy of interpretation. Observation is the foundation of interpretation. The better we understand the question, the better prepared we are to understand the answer. Chapter 4. One question, three questions, or one conversation. Now that we have slowed down and carefully identified the disciples' question, we can take the next step in our investigation. We need to examine the structure of the question itself. This may sound like a small detail, but it has enormous implications for how people interpret the rest of Matthew 24. In fact, some of the biggest disagreements about this chapter begin right here in verse 3. Matthew records the disciples asking, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Matthew 24:3. At first glance, the question seems straightforward enough. But almost immediately, interpreters begin asking another question. Are the disciples asking one question? Are they asking two questions? Are they asking three separate questions? Or are they expressing one larger concern through several closely related ideas? The reason this matters is because the way a person answers that question often influences the way they read the rest of the chapter. Some interpreters see the destruction of the temple, the coming of the Son of Man, and the end of the age as closely connected in the minds of the disciples. Others see distinct questions that require distinct answers. Still others see a combination of both. Before long, entire prophetic systems can begin developing from assumptions made at this very point in the text. Notice what we are doing differently in this series. We are not beginning by defending a position. We are beginning by observing the evidence. Instead of asking, which interpretation do I prefer? We are asking, what information does the text actually provide? That may seem like a subtle difference, but it is one of the most important habits a Bible student can develop. This is one reason it is helpful to compare the parallel accounts. Matthew records the fullest version of the question, but Mark and Luke also preserve the conversation. Mark records the disciples asking, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled?" Mark 13:4. Luke records, "Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?" Luke 21:7. Immediately, we notice similarities. We also notice differences. All three accounts are clearly discussing the same conversation. All three accounts are connected to Yeshua's prediction concerning the temple, yet each writer emphasizes different details. This observation alone should encourage humility. If faithful interpreters have debated the structure of the question for centuries, perhaps we should be cautious before claiming that the answer is obvious. Sometimes Scripture invites us to slow down and think carefully. Sometimes the most responsible thing we can do is acknowledge that a question deserves further investigation. What can we say with confidence at this point? We can say that all three gospel accounts connect the question to Yeshua's prediction concerning the destruction of the temple. That much is clear. We can also say that Matthew records additional language concerning Yeshua's coming and the end of the age. That much is also clear. What remains to be explored is how those ideas relate to one another within the minds of the disciples and within the structure of Yeshua's answer. Notice how different this approach is from immediately rushing into prophetic debates. We have not discussed preterism. We have not discussed futurism. We have not discussed tribulation timelines. We have not discussed Revelation. We have not even attempted to solve Matthew 24. Instead, we have been doing something much more fundamental. We have been learning how to read carefully. We have been learning how to ask better questions. We have been learning how to observe before concluding. And that brings us back to one of the central themes of this entire series. Good hermeneutics does not begin by defending a system. Good hermeneutics begins by listening carefully to the text. Before we decide what Yeshua's answer means, we should first understand the question he is answering. Before we divide the discourse into sections, we should understand the conversation that produced it. Before we build a timeline, we should understand the assumptions that may have shaped the question itself. The more carefully we examine Matthew 24:3, the more we begin to realize that this verse is not merely an introduction to the discourse. It is the doorway into the discourse. Everything that follows is connected to the question being asked here. and that means understanding the question is not optional. It is essential. But there is still another piece of the puzzle we need to consider. Questions do not arise in a vacuum. They are shaped by assumptions, expectations, and ways of viewing the world. If we want to understand why the disciples asked this question the way they did, we must consider the assumptions they may have brought into the conversation. That is where we turn next. Hermeneutics checkpoint. When I encounter a difficult passage, do I immediately search for an answer, or do I first examine the evidence that produced the question? Am I allowing the text to shape my conclusions, or am I asking the text to support conclusions I reached beforehand? Good interpreters are not merely people who know many answers. They are people who have learned how to ask careful questions, observe honestly, and follow the evidence wherever it leads. Chapter 5. The Assumptions Behind the Questions. One of the most important lessons from our very first video was that nobody reads Scripture as a blank slate. Every one of us brings assumptions, experiences, traditions, and expectations to the text. Sometimes those assumptions help us notice important details. Sometimes they cause us to overlook them. Either way, they are there. Whether we recognize them or not, they influence the way we read. What is interesting is that the disciples were no different. It is easy to read the Gospels and imagine the disciples as if they were merely recording information without any expectations of their own. But that is not how human beings work. The disciples were first-century Jews. They had grown up hearing the Scriptures read. They knew the stories of Israel. They knew the promises given through the prophets. They knew about the kingdom. They knew about Jerusalem. They knew about the coming Messiah. Long before they asked the question recorded in Matthew 24, they already possessed a framework through which they understood the world. This is important because questions are often shaped by assumptions. The way a person frames a question can reveal a great deal about what they already believe. Imagine someone asking, "When are you moving?" The question itself assumes that a move is going to happen. Imagine someone asking, "When will construction begin?" The question assumes that construction has already been planned. Questions frequently reveal expectations that are already present in the mind of the person asking them. The disciples' question appears to be no different. By the time we reach Matthew 24, the disciples have spent years listening to Yeshua teach about the kingdom. They have heard him speak about judgment. They have heard him speak about restoration. They have heard him speak about his role as Messiah. They have watched miracles. They have witnessed confrontations with religious leaders. They have seen crowds respond with both belief and unbelief. Their understanding may not have been complete, but they certainly were not approaching this conversation with empty minds. One of the strongest pieces of evidence for this comes later in the biblical narrative. Even after Yeshua's resurrection, the disciples ask, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" Acts 1:6. Whatever conclusions we draw from that question, it demonstrates something important. The disciples were thinking about restoration. They were thinking about the kingdom. They were thinking about the future. Those expectations did not suddenly appear in Acts. They were already part of the worldview they carried throughout the Gospels. This becomes especially important when we remember what has just happened in Matthew 24. The disciples have heard Yeshua predict the destruction of the temple. For modern readers, that may simply sound like a historical event. For the disciples, however, the temple stood at the center of their religious and national life. It represented worship. It represented covenant history. It represented Jerusalem itself. If the temple was going to be destroyed, that would naturally raise enormous questions about the future. Try to place yourself in their position for a moment. Suppose you believed that Elohim was moving history toward the fulfillment of his promises. Suppose you believed the Messiah was establishing his kingdom. Suppose you believed that restoration was coming. Then suddenly you hear that the temple will be destroyed. How would you process that information? Would you separate that event from every other expectation you held about the future? Or would you naturally begin connecting those ideas together? Most people would connect them. Human beings naturally connect events. When something significant happens, we instinctively begin asking how it relates to everything else we believe. We try to fit new information into our existing understanding of the world. The disciples were not foolish for doing that. They were human. In many ways, they were doing exactly what we would have done. This observation helps explain why we should be careful when reading their question. The disciples may have been connecting several ideas together in their minds. The destruction of the temple, the coming of the Messiah in power, the arrival of the kingdom, the end of the age. Whether those ideas ultimately belong together in exactly the way they imagined is a question for later studies. The important point for now is recognizing that these expectations likely influenced the way they framed their question. And this brings us back to the lesson of video 1. The disciples had assumptions. So do we. Sometimes we read Matthew 24 as if the only assumptions in the passage belong to other people. We critique church traditions, we critique theologians, we critique prophecy teachers. But rarely do we stop and ask a more uncomfortable question. What assumptions am I bringing to this chapter? Have I already decided what the coming means before I examine the evidence? Have I already decided what the end of the age means before I investigate the phrase? Have I already constructed a timeline before I carefully study the text? Those questions are not intended to make us doubt everything we believe. They are intended to help us become more self-aware as students of Scripture. Good hermeneutics requires humility. It requires the willingness to recognize that our assumptions may be helping us in some places and hindering us in others. The disciples brought assumptions into this conversation. Understanding those assumptions helps us understand the question they asked. But there is one assumption in particular that deserves closer examination. It is found in a phrase that many modern readers think they already understand. The phrase is, the end of the age. Before we build conclusions upon that phrase, we should first ask what it meant to the people who used it. That is where our investigation leads next. Hermeneutics checkpoint. The disciples brought assumptions into this conversation. So do I. What assumptions am I bringing to Matthew 24 before I begin reading? Have I examined those assumptions carefully? Or have I simply inherited them from trusted teachers, traditions, study notes, and years of hearing the passage explained a certain way? One of the most valuable habits a Bible student can develop is the willingness to recognize his assumptions before asking the text to confirm them. Chapter 6. What did they mean by the end of the age? As we have worked through this lesson, one theme has appeared repeatedly. Good hermeneutics requires us to slow down. It requires us to resist the temptation to assume we already know what a passage means before we have carefully examined the evidence. We saw this principle when we looked at the conversation that created the question. We saw it again when we examined the significance of the temple. We saw it when we discussed the assumptions the disciples may have brought into the conversation. Now we encounter another opportunity to put that principle into practice. The disciples ask Yeshua about the end of the age. For many modern readers, that phrase immediately produces a mental picture. We hear the words and instantly think of a particular event, a particular timeline, or a particular theological system. The problem is that our first reaction is not always the same as the author's intention. One of the recurring principles of this series has been that the meaning of a text is determined by the author, not the reader. Therefore, before we ask what the phrase means to us, we should first ask what it meant to the people who used it. Notice something very important. The disciples do not ask about the end of the world. They ask about the end of the age. That may seem like a small distinction, but good Bible students learn to pay attention to distinctions. Words matter. Definitions matter. The language chosen by the biblical authors matters. This is where the lesson from video 3 becomes especially important. Before building doctrine from a phrase, we should first investigate the phrase. Rather than immediately importing a definition, we should ask how Scripture itself uses the language. We should ask whether the expression appears elsewhere. We should ask how Matthew uses it. We should ask how people living in that world would likely have understood it. One of the first things we discover is that Matthew uses this expression more than once. Earlier in his gospel, Yeshua uses the phrase, the end of the age, in the parables of Matthew 13. In Matthew 13:39, he says, the harvest is the end of the age. In Matthew 13:40, he again speaks of the end of this age. In Matthew 13:49, he repeats the expression once more. Then at the end of the gospel, Yeshua tells his disciples, "I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Matthew 28:20. The point is not to explain all of those passages right now. The point is simply to observe that Matthew is not introducing a brand new concept in chapter 24. The phrase already exists within his vocabulary. His readers are expected to recognize it. As we continue our investigation, another important observation emerges. Many Jewish people in the first century thought about history in terms of two ages. There was the present age, and there was the age to come. Different groups understood the details differently, but the basic framework was widespread. History was moving toward a destination. Elohim was guiding history toward the fulfillment of his purposes. The future age was often associated with themes such as restoration, resurrection, judgment, kingdom, and fulfillment. Again, the exact details varied from group to group, but the larger framework helps us understand why the disciples would use this kind of language. Now notice what we are doing. We are not yet answering every question. We are not constructing a timeline. We are not trying to settle every eschatological debate. Instead, we are doing what responsible interpreters do. We are investigating vocabulary. We are examining context. We are trying to understand how the participants in the conversation may have understood the language they were using. In other words, we are practicing hermeneutics. This is one reason I believe Matthew 24 is such a valuable case study for learning how to study Scripture. Almost every temptation that confronts a Bible student appears in this chapter. The temptation to rush ahead, the temptation to assume definitions, the temptation to import our theological systems into the text, the temptation to answer questions before we have fully understood them. Matthew 24 forces us to slow down and ask whether we are truly listening to the text or merely listening to ourselves. At the beginning of this lesson, we asked a simple question. Before interpreting Yeshua's answer, should we understand the question that prompted it? After examining the evidence, I believe the answer is clearly yes. We have discovered that the question did not appear in a vacuum. It emerged from a conversation that began in Matthew 23. We have discovered that the prediction concerning the temple helps explain why the disciples were so concerned. We have discovered that the disciples brought assumptions and expectations into the discussion. We have discovered that even the vocabulary of the question deserves careful investigation. And yet, despite everything we have learned, we still have not attempted to solve Matthew 24. That is not a failure. That is the lesson. Good hermeneutics does not always begin by giving answers. Sometimes good hermeneutics begins by teaching us how to ask better questions. Sometimes the most important thing we can learn is not what conclusion to reach, but how to approach the evidence that leads to a conclusion. And now that we have done that work, we are finally ready to step back and consider what we have learned from this investigation as a whole. Hermeneutics checkpoint. When I encounter an unfamiliar biblical phrase, do I immediately assign a meaning to it, or do I first investigate how Scripture uses the phrase? Am I allowing the biblical authors to define their own vocabulary, or am I assuming that my modern understanding is automatically the same as theirs? One of the most valuable habits a Bible student can develop is the willingness to let Scripture define its own terms before building conclusions upon them. Conclusion. When many people approach Matthew 24, they begin with the answers. They begin with timelines. They begin with prophetic systems. They begin with debates about tribulation, the coming of the Son of Man, the gathering of the elect, and the chronology of future events. There is certainly a place for those discussions. But before we can responsibly discuss the answers, we must first understand the question. That has been the purpose of this lesson. Throughout this investigation, we have deliberately resisted the temptation to rush ahead. Instead, we have tried to do what good hermeneutics requires. We examined the conversation that created the question. We looked at the significance of the temple and the shocking nature of Yeshua's prediction. We carefully observed the wording of the disciples' question. We considered the assumptions they may have brought into the conversation. And we investigated one of the key phrases contained within the question itself. In other words, We have done the work. And because we have done the work, we have earned the right to make a few interpretive observations. What we can say with confidence. We can say with confidence that Matthew 24 does not begin in Matthew 24. The conversation begins in Matthew 23. The chapter division may be useful for navigation, but it should never cause us to separate a question from the conversation that created it. We can say with confidence that the disciples' question was triggered by Yeshua's prediction concerning the destruction of the temple. Before they asked about signs, before they asked about his coming, and before they asked about the end of the age, they first heard him announce that the temple would be thrown down. We can say with confidence that the temple stood at the center of the disciples' world. It represented worship, identity, history, and hope. The prediction of its destruction would naturally raise profound questions about the future. We can say with confidence that the disciples were not blank slates. Like all human beings, they approached this conversation with assumptions, expectations, and a worldview shaped by the scriptures and by their understanding of Elohim's promises. We can say with confidence that the phrase, "the end of the age," deserves investigation rather than assumption. The disciples chose those words for a reason, and responsible interpretation requires us to understand how they used them before building conclusions upon them. And perhaps most importantly, we can say with confidence that understanding the question is essential to understanding the answer. Matthew 24:3 is not a speed bump on the way to prophecy. It is the doorway into the entire discourse. Now, does that solve every debate surrounding Matthew 24? Of course not, but that was never our goal. The goal was not to prove a prophetic system. The goal was to learn how to approach Scripture responsibly. And if we have learned anything from this lesson, it is that good hermeneutics often requires patience. It requires us to observe before concluding. It requires us to define terms before building doctrine. It requires us to understand the question before interpreting the answer. What we have earned the right to ask next. Because we have taken the time to understand the context of the question, we are now prepared to ask the next set of questions. What event is Yeshua actually describing? What is the gathering? What is the relationship between the gathering and the resurrection? Are different passages describing the same event or different events? Before deciding where an event belongs on a timeline, how do we determine what event the passage is describing in the first place? Those are the questions that will lead us into our next lesson. Final hermeneutics checkpoint. Have I carefully understood the question before interpreting the answer? Or am I asking Scripture to answer questions that the original conversation was never intended to address? The better we understand the question, the better prepared we are to understand the answer. And before we can determine when an event occurs, we must first determine what event is actually being described. That is where we turn next. With this lesson, we've completed the first act of our journey together. We've learned to recognize our assumptions. We've learned to let Scripture define its own language. We've learned to understand context before drawing conclusions. And we've learned that before interpreting an answer, we must first understand the question that prompted it. Now it's time to begin applying those tools. In our next study, we'll begin Act 2 of our journey, applying the toolbox. We'll investigate one of the most important questions in all of biblical prophecy. When Scripture speaks about the resurrection, when it speaks about the gathering of Yahovah's people, when it speaks about the coming of Messiah, are these describing the same event or different events? Before we can determine when an event occurs, we must first determine what event the passage is actually describing. That's where our investigation continues as we begin Act 2, applying the toolbox. Please proceed to Video 5.